Have you ever wondered if it was time to set aside the old iPad and buy a new iPad, and then you go on YouTube to inform yourself on which iPad to buy, only to come away more confused than ever? If you're anything like me, you have. I'm not knocking any of those super techie videos, but honestly, I don't need to see all the detailed specs and Geekbench scores to make a decision. I just want to know if a new iPad will be better than my old iPad, and enough so that I won't regret the purchase. Believe it or not, making that decision is not that hard once you cut through all the noise. So I'm going to keep this video as straightforward as possible. If you're thinking about buying a new iPad, then stick around. This video is for you. Hi, my name is Rich. I just bought a couple of new fancy iPads. But if I didn't have a YouTube channel, I doubt that I would have made those purchases. I had a great 2018 iPad Pro that was serving me just fine. Anyway, if you're thinking about buying a new iPad, then at least to me, there are really only 3 filters you need to use to help make that decision. Are there hardware features you need or want that are only available on a new iPad? Second, are there software features that you need or want that will only run on a new iPad? And lastly, the cost. And that's pretty much it. Now remember, I'm not going to be diving into any deep technical specs. I'll leave that to other creators who like to make videos on that kind of stuff. The goal of this video is to provide you with simple guidance so that you can make a decision. Nothing complicated here. Okay, I think the best place to start is with the actual form factor. Apple makes the 8.3-inch iPad mini, the 10.9-inch iPad, or base iPad as I call it, the 11-inch iPad Air, the new 13-inch iPad Air, the 11-inch iPad Pro, and now the new 13-inch iPad Pro. So that's 6 different iPads. But really, there's only 3 different sizes: the 8.3-inch mini, the 11-inch iPad, iPad Air and iPad Pro, and then lastly the 13-inch iPad Air and iPad Pro. And if you have the ability to test out how each of these feel in your hands by going to a nearby store that sells iPads, then by all means do so. When I only had the 11-inch iPad, I thought I'd never want anything bigger, and then I got the 13-inch iPad Pro, and I thought I'd never want anything smaller until I got the iPad mini. But again, I make YouTube videos, so it's doubtful you'll be buying all the iPad. But check them out if you can. Not to complicate matters, but the size of the iPad does have a bearing on the size of the keyboard. That is, if you plan to use the Apple Magic Keyboard for iPad. And the easiest one for me to use is the big one, the one for the 13-inch iPad Pro. I've got the keyboard for the 11-inch iPad Air as well as the keyboard for the base iPad, and I'm content using either of those, no problem. But there's no getting around that the bigger keys are easier to use. Now, having said that, I often use Apple's Magic Keyboard and Trackpad, and I know all these names that contain the word magic get confusing. I'm talking about Apple's keyboard and trackpad that can be used with most any Apple product, including their computers. And honestly, I like this setup the best of all, but it's not as mobile as the custom keyboard made for the iPad. When I travel, I pack the iPad and the Apple Magic Keyboard for iPad in my suitcase and I roll. But when I'm home, I mostly just use the keyboard and trackpad on my desk. Now, going hand in hand with the size or form factor of the iPad is the screen size. Almost every year, Apple will make some small improvements to the screens like, thinner bezels, or maybe they're a little brighter or something like that. But to me, all of these screens look great. They're bright, the colors are rich, and the clarity is second to none. And whether it's the small iPad mini or the big 13-inch iPad, they all just, look great. Now, I will say that the 2024 iPad Pro 13-inch with the new OLED screen looks a lot better than anything that's come before. As I show you these screens, you probably can't tell much of a difference, but you sure can when you hold it in your hand. This OLED screen is, at least to me, a big step forward, but there's a price to pay, which we'll cover in a minute. In the end, the size of the screen is, personal preference. I will say that the screen size of the iPad mini is great for note-taking. The big 13-inch iPad screen is like a laptop screen, and the 11-inch iPad screen is, in between. Apple is trying to provide a sweet spot for all their different customers. If you have an older iPad with a big round Touch ID home button, you need to know that that's been replaced by a Touch ID button on the side of the iPad. But even if you're used to a Touch ID button, you might want to look into an iPad with Face ID. Face ID came out a number of years ago. All you have to do is look at your iPad and it opens up. And to me, it's way faster and handier than Touch ID. But Touch ID is just fine. Touch ID comes on the non-Pro iPads. Face ID is reserved for the iPad Pros. And I'm used to both, and it just comes down to personal preference. However, when you're making a buying decision, just know you have to pick the right model to get what you're looking for. Now, if you make Face ID or Zoom calls, then a new iPad, other than the iPad mini, might make sense. If you have an older iPad, you know the camera facing you is on the side of the iPad. That is, if you're holding the iPad in landscape mode, which almost everyone on planet Earth does. What that means is as you look at your iPad during the call, it looks like you're looking off to the side, not into the camera. It's just weird. Apple began fixing that issue after years of complaints with the base iPad 10. And now all the iPads, with the exception of the iPad mini, have this camera on the long side of the iPad to be used in landscape mode. Now, I try not to let these little things bother me, but this is one that always did. I am so glad that's been fixed, and you will be too the next time you make a FaceTime call. Plus, the new iPads now come with something called Center Stage. It's a camera trick that keeps you in the center of the image even if you move around a little bit. It's like you have your own cameraman following you. It's pretty cool. A couple of smaller things that might influence your buying decisions are the speakers and the photo camera. As for the iPad speakers, they all sound pretty good considering the sound is coming from a thin slab of glass. I will say that the bigger iPads sound better than the smaller iPads. They've got 2 more speakers. If the quality of the sound or the volume matter to you, then it's best you go to a store and listen for yourself. I thought about having a sound test in this video, but that's getting into the weeds a bit, and especially if you're watching this video on an iPhone. I think you get the idea. As for the camera, not the one you use for FaceTime calls, it's pretty good. But I almost never take a photo with my iPad. I always use my iPhone to take pictures and videos. Now, I do use the camera on the iPad to scan paper documents, and it works well enough. I will say that the cameras have improved greatly over the years. You can get some really good photos with the new iPads, whereas cameras from the much older iPads don't produce nearly the photographic quality as the new stuff. I've not mentioned the Apple Pencil, but all the iPads support a version of the Apple Pencil, so there's no need to go into that, too much. I will say that the ability to charge the Apple Pencil by snapping it to the top of the iPad is handy. The base iPad requires a cable to charge, so there's that. And the brand new Apple Pencil Pro has a few tricks up its sleeve that the other Apple Pencils don't, so keep that in mind. So if you need a bigger or smaller iPad, a bigger or brighter screen, an iPad that can handle a larger keyboard, or you're just wanting to move to Face ID from Touch ID, then it might be time to consider making a purchase. But if none of that stuff matters, then you need to move to the next filter, which is the software side of things. Honestly, this is the easy part of this video, and here it is. If the iPad you currently own supports the latest version of iPad OS, and you're happy with the iPad hardware features, then to me, there's no need to buy the newest iPad. That's where I was with the 2018 iPad Pro. There was nothing about that iPad that made me scream for a new iPad. And it wasn't just adequate, it was a really good iPad. But again, I do all this YouTube stuff, so I'm buying an iPad, so you won't have to. Apple, to their credit, provides iPad software support for a long time. And what that means is that whether you have an older iPad or a brand new iPad, the user experience is about the same. And for that reason, I think hanging on to an iPad for a while just makes sense. However, if your iPad no longer supports the latest version of iPad OS, then it might be time to make a purchase. My guess is that if your iPad is that old, you'll be pleased with any new iPad you choose. All right, lastly, we need to look at pricing, and there are some big differences. The base 10.9-inch iPad lists for $349. The iPad mini lists for $499. The 11-inch iPad Air lists for $599. The 13-inch iPad Air lists for $799. The 11-inch iPad Pro lists for $999. And the 13-inch iPad Pro lists for $1299. Now the 13-inch iPad Pro that I just bought is the best iPad I have ever owned. It's absolutely fantastic. But it runs the same software as the base iPad that costs $950 less. That's just a huge gap. But having said that, there are major differences in the form factor and the hardware, bells and whistles. I'm not sure if the 13-inch iPad Pro is $950 better than the base iPad, but it is a way better iPad, at least to me. Look, in the end, if the iPad you own suits you just fine, then ignore all the advertisements designed to get you to part with your money. Just continue using it till it no longer suits you, and then make a change. So there you have it. Is it time for you to buy a new iPad? I don't know. But I do know if you use these 3 filters, namely hardware features, software version, and cost, you should be able to make a decision you can live with fairly quickly. Okay, I hope this video was not too complicated. It's so easy to get in the weeds on this stuff. All right, that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.